Hello everyone, it's Kevin Adkisson, curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, and today I'm over at the Middle School for Boys and we are swinging into a new Live at 5. And though the Middle School for Boys doesn't have the best play facilities here at Cranbrook, those are at Brookside, the Middle School for Boys does have one of my favorite play sculptures, and that is Jim Miller-Melberg's Porpoise from about 1960. And so today we're going to be taking a closer look at this distinguished concrete play sculpture. We are over at the Middle School for Boys, which is at the far edge of Cranbrook's campus. Originally, this building behind the Porpoise was called the Vaughan School, and this was a gift of George and Ellen Booth to the city of Bloomfield Hills in 1931. It was one of the city's elementary schools until the early 1980s, when Bloomfield Hills closed it as an elementary school and Cranbrook purchased the building back, and it opened as our Middle School for Boys. And it has a number of additions, including this one from about 2005 by Dan Hoffman. Now, the main campus, if you're not familiar with where I am, the main campus, the Institute of Science is right there, the Art Museum is through there, the boys' school is through there, but it's about a 15-minute walk down here, and that's faculty housing that you're seeing there, and then what we call the valley where our SALT and school buses are. So it is kind of of the campus. And I wanted to talk about this sculpture slash play piece because it's something that has come into Cranbrook's collection in my time here. And so this piece has been out here flopping away since about 2019. It was a gift to Cranbrook from the estate of Jim Miller. And Jim Miller is a very interesting artist that you may not know his name, but you probably have played on one of his sculptures or played basketball on one of his concrete basketball hoops. And so Mr. Jim Miller was born in Minneapolis in 1929. He moved to Detroit in 1933 with his father. His father was a master mold maker, so he made wooden and metal molds. In the 20s, his father had made decorative ironwork, but when he relocated because of the Great Depression to Detroit, he began making molds for the auto industry. And so Jim Miller was living in Detroit. At the age of 7, he started apprenticing in his father's mold shop, starting with sweeping the floors and then burnishing metal products and then working up until he had become a journeyman craftsman. He himself was a master craftsman. I think I'm reconnected now, I hope. So young Jim Miller, he learns from his father's shop. He watches his father's expertise, and he goes off to the University of Michigan in 1947 to study architecture. He was there for 2 years. He did not suit well with architecture school. Interestingly, he would have overlapped with Charles Moore, the great postmodernist, who was also Michigan class of 49. But Jim Miller, he leaves Ann Arbor, he studies at Wayne for a year, and then he heads out to Europe, and he goes to England and France and spends some time in Florence. And in England, he goes and he visits with Henry Moore. And so I think if you know the work of the great British sculptor Henry Moore, you can see some of the sort of shape and curves and solid mass of Moore's work. He also goes and visits the studio of Barbara Hepworth and a ceramicist, Bernard Leach. But his biggest lesson in sort of arts came from a year spent in Paris with the Russian-French Cubist sculptor Osip Zadkin. And Osip Zadkin was a Cubist. He practiced until the 1960s. And Jim Miller learned tons from working in Ossip's studio. He was drafted to the Korean War, and he served in Korea until 1955, when he came back and he enrolled at Cranbrook. In 1955, 1956 was a very interesting time to be at the Art Academy at Cranbrook, because it was right after the sort of founding members of Cranbrook were either had passed away or left. And so he was here after Saarinen's death, after George and Ellen Booth's death, but most importantly for someone in the sculpture department, he was here after Carl Milles and Olga Milles had returned to Sweden. And so Miller would have studied with Glenn Chamberlain, who was an Iowa-born artist who studied with Grant Wood, who painted American Gothic. And then, interestingly, Chamberlain went off to Paris and also studied with Ossip Zadkin. So Miller is only here at Cranbrook for 18 months. He does not get a degree. Again, school does not suit him. He goes off to Ann Arbor, where he teaches undergraduate sculpture, but he didn't find that sort of teaching was where he could be most creative. And so in 1960, he set up his own company called Form Inc., and they made play structures. And so this is probably what he is most known for, are his playground pieces. Form Inc. Was run by Mr. Miller from 1960 to 1981. It's around this time that he also adopts the name Jim Miller-Melberg. And Melberg was his grandfather's last name. His grandfather was a Swedish immigrant, and in 1880, when he landed in New York, he changed his name from Melberg to Miller. And so in order to distinguish himself from all the other Jim Millers, our Jim Miller adopted his grandfather's Swedish last name. And so Jim Miller-Melberg is building these concrete play structures, and they really are sort of play places and sculpture all in one. He would start with fiberglass molds using the skills that he had learned with his father to make these incredibly complex, fully 360-degree fiberglass molds. And then he would build the steel form of the porpoise inside of the mold, and then cast the concrete, and then these elaborate molds would be snapped apart, and you would be left with the plaything. His most famous animal is probably the turtle, which there is one of his turtles over at Brookside School. They're also all over Detroit and all over the country. But he also made camels and elephants. He made trees. He made play sculptures. He made a Swiss cheese castle. There was the moon house. There was the saddle slide. And then he also made benches and barbecues and chess tables and basketball hoops, water fountains. He had a whole line of this cast concrete park furniture. And what I love about the animals is that Mr. Miller-Melberg said that he wasn't trying to make them cartoons. He didn't want them to be abstractions. He wanted them to be real for the children. And so he wanted to sort of achieve this reality through abstraction so that they would be these kind of friends within the environment. And he didn't really think of them as play structures so much as parts of total environments. I think here at Cranbrook, our porpoise is quite formally placed, but Miller-Melberg was thinking back to his childhood, and after the family moved from Minneapolis to Detroit, they then lived in South Lyon, which is where he spent most of his formative years, and they were on a creek, and there were all these rocks and forest glens, and so he wanted his play environments to have that same kind of feeling of being able to explore and sort of climb on top of something, and you're not only on top of the porpoise, you're on top of the whole world that you create. So it has this real kind of creativity and discovery to the best of his work. And I'm going to post some photos of his work in the stories after I finish this tour of the porpoise. He views them as half sculpture and half half sculpture, half plaything, and it's part of this whole kind of mid-century idea of good design and better living. And Miller-Melberg talks about creating pieces that have a sense of beauty, but then that also encourage physical growth. So he really wants you to engage with these pieces. Now, this is Porpoise number 1. There are unknown hundreds of them that were made, but our Porpoise was a gift from the Miller-Melberg estate, and Mr. Jim Miller passed away in 2018, and this was the piece that he had, the first piece that he made in the porpoise form, and he kept it at his house in Birmingham. So this was in the backyard of his Birmingham house. You can see that it was never painted, which a lot of his pieces, unfortunately, have been painted by various parks departments. But because it wasn't painted, you can really get the beauty of the different materials. So the different granite chips, the sand, this sort of charcoal gray concrete mixture. And then you can jump on it, you can climb it, you can be friends with it. It is pretty darn hardy. And his pieces really are all across the world. The first turtles and porpoises were made for the Deffer Elementary in Grosse Pointe Park. Later, he did the basketball courts for Miami-Dade County Parks. He did custom pieces for Los Angeles parks. And he always had to think about how does he ship these from his Michigan warehouse. And so the concrete pieces, he would design ways that they would sculpturally fit together on the back of a flatbed truck as well, because he realized that if he had these sculptural play sets priced as sculpture, no one would be able to afford them. And so he had to be able to compete with what was on the market already and come up with his skill of mold making and casting combined with his knowledge of sort of logistics, and then be able to ship and sell these all around the country. So I don't think we can undorsal it. It is a steel reinforced hunk of concrete. Moving it here was quite an adventure. I'll step away from it so you can get a sense of how we placed it. We placed it in conjunction with the head of the middle school for boys, as well as the Cranbrook Capital Projects team, and then the staff here at the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And we wanted to think about how Eliel Saarinen placed his sculptures around Cranbrook campus, or the sculptures of Carl Millis. And so you see this unornamented expanse of windows running down, and then at the end of the run of windows there is this depression with the brick wall. And so much like Saarinen at Dorm 2, where you have Millis's running horse that's placed centered on a large blank wall, we thought that the porpoise sort of swooping up would be backgrounded by this building. The building is by J. Robert F. Swanson, who is, of course, the son-in-law of Eliel and Loya Saarinen, and this was one of his first buildings. So I don't know if you have any other questions. I'm so happy to see in the comments people who have enjoyed these sculptures or seen them around. You know, he started studying architecture, but he, of course, never finished a degree, and he made his play pieces were all made from just 1960 to 1981. In 1981, he sold the company Form Inc. to Wausau Tile, which is a Wisconsin-based cast concrete company. If you go online right now, you will see that they're not selling the porpoises, but they're still selling the turtles and the basketball and the benches and trash cans. After he sold his play company, he really just made sculpture and drawing. So he was a lifelong artist on paper as well, something that his mother had also done. And so he did practice art for the rest of his career, but he didn't make play places after 1981. In that idea of the sort of architect or the architectural play place, though, he was in conversation with this whole post-war movement from the Swedish playground sculpture movement. Alvar Aalto designed playgrounds. Probably the most famous post-war architect, Aldo van Eyck, designed hundreds of play places around Amsterdam. And then here in America, you have people like Noguchi designing play places. Many of Noguchi play places were never built, but one of my favorites is in Piedmont Park in Atlanta, a national, I think it's now been given National Historic Park landmark designation. But it is this whole wonderful idea that the architect could envision and design a whimsical, interesting, childlike architectural playground that uses the best of mid-century design and the best of sort of form. Very little concern for life safety, but using abstraction and form to create these really imaginative and beautiful places. So I hope you have enjoyed this short Live at 5 closer look at the Porpoise sculpture from circa 1960 to 1970 by Jim Miller-Melberg, Cranbrook Academy of Art, former student. And again, thank you to the Miller estate for giving Cranbrook this beautiful porpoise. I hope that the boys here at the middle school enjoy him hanging out here in the corner. And I hope that one day when we're back open and you take a walk around, you will find him hanging out here on the backside of campus. I'll be on Facebook tomorrow for a Live at 5 tour of Cranbrook House, the Booth Manor home. The Facebook tours are more in-depth, about 45-minute tours of whole buildings or parts of buildings. And then I'll be back here on Instagram Live at 5 on Thursday, hopefully coming from the Academy of Art Library. See you then. Be well, be safe, stay at home.